Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhaso, and this morning we'll be looking at another discourse of the Buddha. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the discourse and give some explanation. And then if there's any questions, I'll answer those at the end. So starting with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So the discourse for this morning is from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 3. Sutta number 39, Sukhumāla Sutta. And the word Sukhumāla means refined or subtle. So I'm reading here from Bhante Suddhaso's translation, where he has it translated a little bit differently. So he translated Sukhumāla as delicate, which is not quite right. The meaning is more, again, refined or subtle. So the Buddha begins, and the sutta starts off in a bit of an amusing way, so bear with me. The Buddha begins, he says, "My lifestyle was refined, most refined, extremely refined." He's here talking about before he became a monk. So as you may already know, the Buddha was born into a very wealthy and politically powerful family. So he was raised in conditions of extreme luxury and refinement. So he begins this sutta by talking a little bit about his refined, luxurious lifestyle prior to beginning his spiritual life. So he says, "Monks, my lifestyle was refined, most refined, extremely refined. In my father's home, lotus ponds were made just for me. In some, blue water lilies blossomed, while in others there were pink or white lotuses, just for my benefit." And he says, "I only used sandalwood from Kasi, and my turbans, jackets, sarongs, and robes also came from Kasi." Apparently Kasi was famous for its sandalwood and for its cloth. This is mentioned in a few places in the suttas. These days that would be a bit like saying everything, like all your clothes, everything is Louis Vuitton or Dolce & Gabbana or something like that. So everything was the best of the best, top quality. And he says, "And a white parasol was held over me night and day with the thought, 'Don't let cold, heat, grass, dust, or damp bother him.'" So apparently he had servants following him around with umbrellas all the time. And he continues, he says, "I had 3 palaces, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one for the rainy season." So in ancient India, they didn't classify 4 seasons, as we do in more northern climates, but rather 3 seasons. So the cold season, the hot season, and the wet season. So he says, "I had 3 palaces, one for the winter, one for the summer, one for the rainy season. I stayed in a palace without coming down for the 4 months of the rainy season, where I was entertained by musicians, none of them men." He says, "While the servants, workers, and staff in other houses are given rough gruel to eat, in my father's home they were given fine rice with meat." So this is interesting that he's also pointing out that it wasn't just him and his family that were living well, but also their servants and workers were given better treatment than in other places. And then the Buddha says, "Amid such prosperity and such a refined lifestyle." So again, he's pointing out here, like he was actually having a really good life. Like he wasn't struggling in any way. Like everything, he was at the peak of luxury as was possible at the time. He had everything he wanted. Everything was very refined, very luxurious, very high quality. He didn't lack anything at all. Everything was great from a materialist standpoint, everything was great. But he says, amid such prosperity and such a refined lifestyle, I thought. Remember, this is before the Buddha started his monastic life. He says, I thought, when an uneducated commoner, that's asuttava patujana, when an uneducated commoner who is liable to grow old, liable to decrepitude, not exempt from decrepitude, and not exempt from aging, when they see someone else who is old and decrepit, they are horrified, repelled, and disgusted, overlooking the fact that they themselves are in the same situation. And the Buddha continues, he says, but since I too am liable to old age, it would not be appropriate for me to be horrified, embarrassed, and disgusted when I see someone else who is old. And he says, reflecting like this, I entirely gave up the vanity of youth. So in the sutta, the Buddha is giving 3 contemplations. And so this is the first one. The first one is, again, he gives the example of an ordinary person who hasn't heard the Dhamma, who hasn't practiced the Dhamma to any degree. And when such a person, being young and obsessed with youth, when they see people who are very elderly, very decrepit, experiencing the weakness and frailty and difficulties of old age, that's often disturbing. It's something which is actually quite upsetting, something which can be repulsive or disgusting. But the Buddha says that the proper reflection is actually to consider. But we also are subject to aging. We also are subject to decrepitude. It's going to happen to us as well. So it's not appropriate to be repelled by the decrepitude and old age of other people, because we're actually in the same condition. So this is pointing to the first of the 3 kinds of vanity that he's talking about here in this sutta. And vanity is Bhante Suddhaso's translation of the word madda, which more precisely means intoxication. So there's another sutta where the Buddha says there's 4 kinds of intoxication. So intoxication with alcohol, it's the obvious one that we're used to. Then there's intoxication with youth, intoxication with health, and intoxication with life. So in this sutta, the Buddha is focusing on those last 3. So intoxication with youth, health, and life, which here is translated as vanity. Vanity of youth, vanity of health, vanity of life. So when we're young, it's very easy to get caught up in identifying with being young. It's very easy to become enamored, intoxicated with youth, with the vibrancy of youth, the sense of possibility of youth, the vivacity, the liveliness of being young. Completely missing the fact that that's a temporary condition. It's not who we are, it's just a temporary condition that we're experiencing, in which, like everybody else, it comes and it goes. We're young for a while, and then we start getting old. So very quickly youth fades. So to be attached to and to identify with youth is inevitably creating the conditions for suffering and delusion in the mind. So then the second one, the Buddha says, when an uneducated commoner who is liable to get sick, not being exempt from sickness, sees someone else who is sick, they are horrified, repelled, and disgusted, overlooking the fact that they themselves are in the same situation. But since I too am liable to get sick, it would not be appropriate for me to be horrified, embarrassed, and disgusted when I see someone else who is sick. And the Buddha says, reflecting like this, I entirely gave up the vanity of health. So again, this is the second one. So reflecting on the universality of sickness, that everyone is subject to sickness. So again, when we ourselves are healthy, when we're in good health, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that health is a temporary condition. It's very easy to lose sight of the fact that we're subject to sickness, just as everybody else is. So when we're in good health, obsessed with our health, intoxicated with health, enamored with health, then when we see other people who are having health problems, it's often difficult to empathize. We're just like, oh, what's wrong with them? They should just get over it already. It's like, oh, well, they should take better care of themselves. It must be their fault. So there's a tendency to not empathize and instead to be fixated on our own pleasant condition, our own pleasant circumstances of being healthy. But what the Buddha is encouraging us here to do is instead to reflect, oh, I also am subject to the same thing. I also am subject to sickness. Maybe right now I'm experiencing good health, but that's not permanent. And it doesn't define who I am. It's just the way things are right now. So even if you've had really good health for your entire life, well, that can change at any moment. Starting today, you might be chronically sick for the rest of your life. And that's just the way things go. And in fact, the older you get, the more likely it is. The body starts breaking down. Things stop working as well as they used to. So dropping the vanity of health, intoxication with health. So this attachment and self-identity connected with health. And here also, all of this is also pointing a bit more indirectly at the cultivation of compassion. So when we see other people dealing with the challenges of aging and sickness, then by reflecting, oh, I also am subject to the same thing. And if I am the one who is experiencing the challenges of aging and sickness, then what would I hope for from others? Well, I would hope for kindness. I would hope for assistance. I would hope for support. So then we can also then offer kindness and assistance and support to the others we see that are struggling with aging and health problems. And then the third one, the Buddha says, when an uneducated commoner who is liable to death, not being exempt from death, sees someone else who is dead, they are horrified, repelled, and disgusted, overlooking the fact that they themselves are in the same situation. But since I too am liable to die, it would not be appropriate for me to be horrified, embarrassed, and disgusted when I see someone else who is dead. The Buddha says, reflecting like this, I entirely gave up the vanity of life, or intoxication with life. So this is the reflection on death, on the inevitability of death, the reality of death. So recognizing that death is a natural part of reality. So beings are born, they live for a while, and then they die. That's completely normal. It's the standard cycle of birth and death. And again, what often happens is that we are attached to life, we're obsessed with life, we don't want to die, we don't even want to think about death. And so then when we find out somebody else has died, well, we don't want to think about it. We don't want to face the fact. Actually, this is demonstrated quite clearly if you've ever been to an open casket funeral. A lot of effort is put into making it look like the body is still alive. So this, I still remember when I went to my father's funeral, which was about 20 years ago now. When I went to my father's funeral, at the time he had already been dead for over a week. And under natural conditions, if a body has been dead for over a week, it is very decomposed. So even in a few days, a body will decompose quite dramatically. But a lot of effort is put into preserving the corpse, into applying things which will prevent the decomposition process. And what I found particularly ghastly and bizarre was that for the funeral, a lot of makeup was put on the face to make it look like the person was just sleeping. So they would put rouge on the cheeks so it looks like there's still blood flowing through the veins, even though the person's been dead for a week. Like there's no possibility that they would still have blush in their cheeks. It just doesn't work that way. So a lot of effort put into cover up the decomposition that had already started. So makeup on the face to try to make it look like the body's still alive. So it's trying to conceal the reality of death from us. This is also notable in the way that we do cemeteries. So cemeteries where everything is very neat and clean and tidy, and the bodies are put in these lovely wooden boxes which are buried in the ground or stored in crypts where you can't see them, and what you actually see is you see headstones with people's names and inspiring quotes, and it is all designed to prevent us from actually directly contemplating the reality of death. And again, the reason for this is because most people are terrified of death. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to face the facts that every single being is subject to death, and that death is a normal part of life. So, of course, we shouldn't be in the opposite extreme of looking forward to death or wanting to die, because, of course, that doesn't actually help things at all. It doesn't solve anything. But instead, we come to a peaceful acceptance of the reality of life and death. The reality that the death is part of the ongoing cycle of life. So the Buddha continues, he says, there are these three vanities, these three forms of intoxication. He says, what three? The vanity of youth, of health, and of life. Or again, intoxication with youth, intoxication with health, and intoxication with life. The Buddha continues, he says, intoxicated with the vanity of youth, an uneducated commoner does bad things by way of body, speech, and mind. When they're separated from their body after death, they're reborn in a place of loss, a bad place, the underworld, in hell. Intoxicated with the vanity of health, again, they do misconduct with body, speech, and mind, and are reborn in hell. And intoxicated with the vanity of life, again, they do misconduct with body, speech, and mind, and are reborn in hell. And he also says, when one is intoxicated with the vanity of youth, health, and life, then a mendicant rejects the training and returns to the lower life. So here he's also talking about a fourth kind of danger. So for lay people or for ordinary people, the problem is that when obsessed with youth and health and life, then one tends to lose one's sense of perspective. One tends to lose one's moral perspective. So when we're young and we think we're going to be young forever, then it's very easy to then make bad choices. Or when we're in good health and we don't want to face the reality of losing our good health, again, it's very easy to make risky choices, to choose to do things which are unnecessarily dangerous. And similarly, when we're obsessed with life, when we have this delusion of immortality, which seems to be particularly common with young people, then once again, we might do things which are quite dangerous, quite foolish, while we're obsessed with that. So even to the point of doing things which are quite evil or immoral, especially when one is not considering the consequences later in life or the consequences in future lives, then one may act with disregard for the moral consequences of our choices. And then he also gives the example of a monk who, because of obsession with youth, obsession with health, obsession with life, that can lead to them renouncing the monastic training and returning to lay life. Because, of course, as a lay person, it's much easier to have access to sensual gratification. And someone who's obsessed with youth, it's like, well, I want to enjoy my youth. I want to enjoy my life while I'm still young. And so they disrobe and pursue sensuality instead of training the mind for awakening. Or thinking, oh, I'm still healthy. Again, I should enjoy it while it lasts. And again, such a person might disrobe and pursue sensual gratification. So this is another danger that he points to. And again, it's notable here in the suttas, whenever the Buddha talks about a monk disrobing, he always says it as, in Pali, it's hinaya vatati, which means returning to inferiority, returning to the inferior state, the inferior condition. It's a reflection on the idea that when we don't contemplate the reality of aging, sickness, and death, then that can lead to us making really foolish decisions, engaging in evil behaviors. And for monastics, it can also lead to disrobing, giving up on the monastic training. And then the Buddha ends the sutta with a short verse. So again, as is common in the Anguttara Nikaya, it ends with a short poem. And so I'll read quickly through the poem. It's basically a reiteration of the point made in the discourse. So the poem says, "For others, sickness is natural, and so are old age and death. Though this is how their nature is, ordinary people feel disgusted. If I were to be disgusted with creatures whose nature is such, it would not be appropriate for me, since my life is just the same." And the Buddha says, "Living in such a way, I understood the Dhamma of non-possessiveness. I overcame all vanity, of health, of youth, and of life, and saw renunciation as safety." In Pali, that's nekkhamme dattu khematang. So that means seeing nekkhamma, which is renunciation, as khema, which means safety. And the Buddha says, "Zeal sprang up in me, or enthusiasm arose in me, as I looked to awakening, to nibbana." The Buddha says, "Now I am unable to indulge in sensuality. There is no turning back. I'm committed to the spiritual life." So that's the end of the discourse. So at this time we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to the people joining in online. Hello to John, Rebecca, Manal, Jayanta, Brian, Christina, Amaranta, Mike, and everybody else who's watching. And I don't actually see any questions online about this discourse. Anything from the residents here? Relatively straightforward. We're all going to die. Okay, great. Yep, we're all going to get old, we're all going to get sick, and we're all going to die. So moral of the story, don't do bad things. And if you're a monk, don't disrobe. It's basically what the Buddha is saying here. Yes, go ahead.
How do you train the mind if there is aging, sickness, and death?
So through constantly reminding yourself. So that's why the Buddha said there's 5 things that we should remind ourselves of every single day. And the first 3 are aging, sickness, and death. So you have to constantly remind yourself. So actually one of my favorite mantras, and I don't normally say it out loud because that tends to weird people out, but I say it a lot internally, is we're all going to die. So just think, as I'm going through my day, often what I'm doing is repeating in my mind, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. And it's just incredible. When you're constantly reflecting on that fact, then your attitude shifts. Every single thing that you're engaged in, you ask yourself, is this actually important? In the face of aging, sickness, and death, is this actually worth doing? Is this actually relevant? Is this actually something which is going to bring me towards what's truly valuable, namely awakening? And then also we tend to let the small things slide. Like somebody is a little bit rude or a little bit disrespectful, it's like, well, who cares? We're all going to die. Or you don't get exactly what you want. Maybe you wanted the chocolate cupcakes, but they're strawberry cupcakes. So you're like, well, we're all going to die. In other words, it doesn't really matter what kind of cupcakes, or even if there's no cupcakes at all, big deal. So it's a way of readjusting our priorities. But yeah, you need to constantly remind yourself of aging, sickness, and death. Because otherwise the mind will just tend to default to obsession with youth, health, and life. Of course, the older you get and the sicker you get, the harder it is to obsess about that. But actually, then old people often are really obsessed with life, terribly afraid of death. As the obsession with youth and health fade, then obsession with life tends to rise. So we need to constantly remind ourselves of these things, or else we tend to forget very easily. Okay? And that looks like it, so I think we'll go ahead and conclude it this time. So you're welcome to join us for the evening's mug chat. You can bring all your questions about Buddhism and we'll do our best to answer. So we'll go ahead and conclude the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.